Well, thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this particular series of lectures. I had to decide, it often happens, I had to decide a title for the talk way before I really knew what I was going to say. So I tried to choose a title that gave me as much latitude as possible. But I think it turns out to be reasonably appropriate for what, in fact, I will say now. I go to Ghana in West Africa at least 2 or 3 times a year, because I take a group of students, American students there, each year for about 10 days, 12 days or so. But I also used to teach at the University of Ghana in Legon, just outside the capital, so I have a sort of ongoing relationship with Ghana, and it's probably the country, certainly the country in Africa that I know the best. I'm going to read you a piece which I've been looking for a way actually of writing something about my sort of strange tangential relationship with Ghana and trying to key it into my relationship with the United States, because as you can hear, I'm not an American. I am actually an American because I'm now an American citizen, but I don't sound like an American citizen. So anyway, this is my attempt to try to say something about my own particular relationship to Ghana, but also my relationship to the United States and to migrancy. Border crossings. And then, of course, it happens, much as it always happens. The driver turns to me and he says, "Mr. Caryl, please, you can maybe help me?" I wait for a beat, and then he continues. He says, "I have a form for the visa lottery. I think it's for 2006, but I don't know how to fill it, and I would like to go out of this place." Awuje has been driving me for 4 days now, and I had half expected this moment from the beginning, but he certainly chose his location well. We're in the small town of Elmina in Ghana, on the west coast of Africa, the site of one of the largest and the most impressive of the slave forts, those troubling edifices from whose dungeons millions of Africans were shipped in conditions of unspeakable misery across the broad expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and deposited into the new American world. I smile somewhat helplessly at Awuje, who now pulls a form out of a battered manila paper folder, and he holds it out for my inspection. I glance at it and I immediately see the problem. The form, which includes instructions for filing, has been downloaded from the internet, presumably by a friend of Awuje's. What my driver does not realize is that this form has to be actually filled out online. Somewhere in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security bureaucrat has made a decision to switch from postal to online filing, and by doing so, he's introduced another level of literacy into the procedure, making it even more difficult for the huddled masses to have access to the richest country on earth. I continue to stare at the form, and then I see another problem. The online application has to be completed and submitted by December the 31st. We are now in late January. Awuje has missed the well-flagged deadline by nearly 4 weeks, which renders the downloaded material doubly useless. I clutch the well-thumbed visa lottery and I tell Awuje that I will speak to him about it at an unspecified time called later on. Awuje wishes to do a little border crossing. In this case, from West Africa to the United States of America, where, incidentally, he knows absolutely nobody. And he is not a young man, far from it. His mass of tightly curled white hair suggests early 60s. The sprightly manner in which he leaves the shade of a tree and runs to the car whenever he sees me coming suggests late 40s. At first I thought he was merely demonstrating his fitness, but I now understand that Owuje is keen to impress upon me just how alert he is to the details of the job. He knows that I will return, and he assumes that there will be more employment. However, I have on more than one occasion told Owuje that whilst I appreciate his efficiency, his sprinting does make me feel a little uncomfortable. Really, there's no need to rush. But then again, Owuje is rushing, not only because he wishes to please me, but because he is also keenly aware that he is a man with a greater mass of life behind him than in front of him. In what time he has left, he wishes to go to the United States of America to have a chance to better himself. And in this sense, he's most certainly in a hurry. He owns his own car, which in Ghana means that he is doing better than the vast majority of the population. And he keeps his car scrupulously clean, for it serves a double function as both status symbol and his sole means of income. I've already noticed that Owuje seems to have some difficulty reading, and he clearly has no understanding of the internet. Yet my driver has worked assiduously over the years to purchase his second-hand blue saloon. The evidence of the car suggests a disciplined man who was focused on a goal and is now reaping the benefits of having achieved it. What's more, he's a driver with foreign contacts, which places him amongst the elite of Ghanaian drivers. But Owuje wants more, and he's prepared to leave his relatively comfortable life in Accra and journey into the unknown in search of material reward. Owuje's imagined border crossing will, so he hopes, allow him to prosper economically. If he's lucky enough to reach the promised land and get a job, then his border crossing will also help the United States of America, for Owuje brings with him a highly developed work ethic. His imagined migration will also allow his native country to prosper, for he plans to remit money to Ghana in order that he might prepare for his return home. For one thing Owuje is sure of is that he has no desire to die on American soil. He intends to undertake his border crossing with an imaginary return ticket. But even as he tells me these facts, I find myself wondering about the price of Owuje's ticket, and I keep fastening hard onto one word which of itself seems somewhat innocuous, but on closer inspection is often freighted with frustration, confusion, and even despair. And that word is, of course, displacement. To be in Ghana and find myself musing on the word displacement is to force me to think of the life of one American man in particular. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in Great Barrington in the rolling Berkshire Hills of southwestern Massachusetts on February the 23rd, 1868, and he died some 95 years later in Ghana. Du Bois was born in the year that Andrew Jackson was impeached, the year that Ulysses S. Grant was elected President of the United States of America, and at a time when African Americans were voting for the very first time in the Reconstruction South. During Du Bois's childhood, Mark Twain was writing Huckleberry Finn, and the newly formed Ku Klux Klan was beginning to make its ugly mark on American life. Du Bois graduated from high school in Great Barrington, the only black student in a class of 13, and he went south to Fisk University in Tennessee, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1888. In the same year, he was admitted as a junior into Harvard, where he famously described his situation. He said, "I was in Harvard, but not of it." In 1890, he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree and thereafter entered Harvard's graduate school. Between 1892 and 1894, he studied at a university in Berlin, and in 1894 returned to the United States, where the following year he became the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. Du Bois subsequently set forth on a remarkable career as a teacher, historian, sociologist, journalist, philosopher, and political activist, a career which ultimately led to his being recognized as a quintessential American Renaissance man. But Du Bois died in Accra, Ghana, in a country that he decided to make his own in 1961 when he was already 93 years of age. Disillusioned by the slow speed and the nature of change in the United States of America, and increasingly attracted to the revolutionary principles of the Communist Party, in the very twilight of his life, Du Bois determined that he would leave the United States and take up the offer of his friend Kwame Nkrumah, the charismatic president of the recently independent country of Ghana, to come home to Africa. In 1961, a somewhat resigned Du Bois renounced his American citizenship, and he set sail for Ghana, where he intended to direct the Encyclopedia Africana, a project that he'd envisaged as early as 1909. 2 years later, on August the 27th, 1963, the day before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the old man slipped quietly from this world. The government of his newly adopted country afforded him a state funeral, and condolences poured in from heads of state in all corners of the world, including China's Mao Zedong, Russia's Nikita Khrushchev, and many others. Sadly, the United States government did not acknowledge the passing of its esteemed but now displaced former citizen, despite having served the country with such distinction for the greater part of the 20th century. The day after his state funeral, the Ghanaian Times carried a front-page editorial under the banner, "Farewell." For the family of the recently departed Du Bois, the official, unforgiving American silence must have deafened any expressions of appreciation from Ghanaians and others. Indeed, border crossings can be expensive and troubling. I've made 3 migrations in my life, all of which have brought me into close proximity with this troubling word, displacement. On July the 12th, 1958, after a somewhat tedious and often fearful journey across the Atlantic Ocean in the lower cabins of a cargo ship, my parents, both of whom were in their early 20s, stepped ashore at New Haven in England and looked all around themselves. They had arrived from St. Kitts in the Eastern Caribbean, and finally they were in Britain. I'm sure that they both harbored different dreams of how they wished their new British lives to unfold, and the evidence of their somewhat acrimonious divorce some few years later would seem to confirm this. However, nearly 50 years ago, on an English summer morning, they stepped ashore, my mother holding me in her arms, my father no doubt already scheming as to what mischief he might get up to. Ostensibly, the pair of them had little reason to feel apprehensive about this new world. Tucked away in the inside pocket of my father's only jacket were the British passports, which not only suggested, but confirmed that they belonged. But this was England in 1958, and within a few weeks of our arrival, both Nottingham and London's Notting Hill exploded in scenes of racial violence, the likes of which had never been seen before on the streets of Britain. My parents had already by this time travelled north to Leeds, where they soon came face to face with the many difficulties that bedevilled West Indians in Britain during this period. Discrimination in housing and employment was openly practiced and commonplace. Pubs and clubs were often segregated, and life was not easy for coloured newcomers. For the first time in their lives, my parents were called nigger. My mother was spat at in the streets, my father punched, they were shortchanged in shops, offered accommodation that you wouldn't kennel your dog in, and constantly, of course, told to go back to the jungle. I was, of course, too young to know what they endured, or how they felt about their welcome in the motherland. But some few weeks ago I did sit with my mother and watch a BBC documentary about the arrival of West Indians in England in the 1950s. And as the programme progressed, my mother fell increasingly quiet, and then she simply left the room. Before she did so, she uttered her parting sentence with a quiet dignity that echoed long after her departure. She turned to me and she said, "I'd forgotten just how awful it was." I sat for a few moments and then I turned off the television. But my parents were not totally naive. Before embarking on the ship in St. Kitts, they did, of course, have some idea that the streets of Britain were not paved with gold. Letters from friends and relatives became the raw material of village gossip. And not every missive spoke with calypso warmth of Britain as the place to be. Not everybody sung the virtues of English fair play and decency of manners. Uncle Leslie complained that he was called Sambo so often he began to think it was his middle name. Uncle Vincent couldn't for the life of him understand why, as he left church, the vicar shook his hand and said it was nice to see him, but please don't bother coming back again next week. And these stories, of course, all made their way back to St. Kitts, and so, in some senses, my parents were prepared for the possibility that despite their British passports and shared cultural values, they might, on arrival, feel somewhat out of tune with Britain. And how right they were. Yet they stayed. And they stayed for one reason. They stayed because of me. In the years and the months that followed, they had other children, and in this sense the pressure was off me a little, because they were now staying because of us. But at least to begin with, there was no doubt that these two extremely proud individuals stayed in Britain and took the abuse and the hostility because of their son. They were English-speaking Christians who had been educated in the British system and who were, in more ways than one, coming home to Britain. But the truth was, they had crossed the water and come to Britain not so that they could feel at home and eat fish and chips and support a football team and go down the boozer and put money on the horses. They came to Britain to get ahead, to grow, and to provide me with the opportunities that I would never have had on the small island of 12 miles by 6 miles that I was born on. And this being the case, of course, the anger, the hurt, and the betrayal that they felt had to be accommodated. The social and the cultural rejection had to be absorbed. They did not feel at home, but in the end, it didn't matter. In 1990, when I was invited to be the visiting writer at Amherst College, a liberal arts college in western Massachusetts, as it turned out, not too far from where W.E.B. Du Bois had been born over a century earlier. The appointment, I understood, was just for one academic year. 8 years later, in 1998, I resigned and took up another academic post in New York City. And 2 years ago, I resigned and joined the faculty of Yale University in New Haven in Connecticut. I may be a little slow, but I'm only now coming to understand that my presence in the United States is evidence of a migration. It's only recently that I felt comfortable answering the question, "Where do you live?" with the answer, New York City, or writing USA against country of domicile on forms that have been officially proffered. In many, many ways, it was the events of September the 11th, 2001, that helped me to understand the degree to which I had become involved with the United States. Like millions of other New Yorkers, I felt the impact of that day and the bizarre days that followed as a participant and not as a global observer. I was shocked, in fact, to the core, but it was a response that was fed by proprietorial anxiety. What made my response all the more surprising to me is the fact that I have never really felt myself to be at home in the United States. I still prefer pubs to bars, soccer as opposed to American football, cricket, not baseball. I still say tomato and not tomato. Spell theatre with an R-E. Tune into the BBC News as often as possible. Avoid waffles, pancakes and donuts. And watch BBC America assiduously. But the United States does not punish me or laugh at me, or belittle me for being who I am. I have been able to cross the Atlantic and enter into this society, and my sense of displacement is, in the context of my parents' experience, deeply designer in character. But this is not, of course, the case for all migrants to the United States. I'm a middle-class man in a middle-class profession who speaks English and who can navigate his way around the system. The land of the free and the home of the brave has always offered up freedom and home as deeply relative concepts, depending upon who or what you are. I would not be waxing so lyrical about the United States were I a Native American, or Arab American, or Muslim American. In this instance, my sense of displacement would not be designer. It would be deeply felt and perhaps painful. But I have been fortunate, and I have stayed on in the United States for the very same reason that my parents stayed on in Britain, because the country offered me the opportunity to grow. I used to think that such opportunity was limitless in Britain, but soon after my arrival in the United States in 1990, I began to meet British writers, doctors, musicians, filmmakers, newspaper editors, and others who were living in the United States because of the opportunities to grow that the country was affording them. More often than not, these people's decisions to live in the United States had little to do with their race, their gender, or their religion, nor was it connected to prejudice or discrimination in Britain. The impulse to migrate in nearly all cases was connected to the individual's craving to better him or herself, which is precisely why I left in 1990 and why I'm still here. As long as growth remains a possibility, then displacement, designer or otherwise, is a price that millions and countless millions of migrants, including my parents, are more than willing to pay. I'm also paying the price for my first migration, although I dearly wish that I didn't have to. In fact, you're all paying the price for my first migration. Everybody in this room is. This was an act of forced migration, the Atlantic slave trade. I don't need to rehearse the iniquities of that trade, nor do I need to convince anybody of its fundamental immorality. However, the racial divide in Europe and in the Americas between those of African origin and others, most commonly whites, is directly related. The difference was sown into the consciousness of people, black and white, during the 17th, 18th, and to some extent 19th centuries. The involuntary migration of millions of Africans is the one border crossing, the one migration that I deeply regret having undertaken. In 1997, an African-American journalist called Keith Richburg published a book entitled Out of Africa, in which, astonishingly enough, he made it clear that he was delighted that the Atlantic slave trade had rescued him from an African future. In fact, he gave thanks for the slave trade, and he and others pointed to the diaspora and achievements of those of African origin in order to support a claim that life in the diaspora is preferable to any kind of life in Africa. It's true enough that in music, in sport, science, literature, in fact in many, many fields, those of African origin have, having passed out of Africa, made major contributions to Western life. But it's surely pernicious to see these achievements as exemplar of the benefits of the slave trade. A triumphant survival of the Middle Passage? I think not. No African, not one, not a single African, wanted to leave Africa, including myself. Those of us in the diaspora are all involuntary migrants. People who were forced to leave land, families, friends, languages, religions, and cultures and begin anew elsewhere. Forced to do so. Our displacement on arrival in the Americas was profound, and it caused a psychic wound which for countless millions of people of African origin continues to fester. Today, many diasporan people of African origin still feel, to borrow Claude McKay's title to his stirring autobiography, a long way from home. Many diasporan Africans are unhappy, worried, even angry. In fact, a not insignificant number are still trying to return to the land that they were snatched and exiled from. I've sat in countries all over the world and talked with those of African origin who feel unmoored and displaced. And I've also sat in half a dozen different African countries and reasoned with those who have returned, many of whom, to my eyes, never look or feel as though they've truly closed the circle, and having undertaken their reverse middle passage, achieved peace. Clearly, to force a people to migrate is to risk setting in motion decades or centuries of heartache. Whatever the raison d'etre for the forced migration, the psychological and spiritual price of such an act is, in my opinion, always, almost always, too high. In the case of the African diaspora, the combined cultural legacy of the Harlem Renaissance is, to my mind, worth nothing when balanced against the anguish of a single African in a male or female dungeon deep in the bowels of Elmina Castle, chained to a now dead and putrefying friend, their mind racked with terror at the thought of what lays ahead over the horizon. When I think of the failure of forced border crossings, I'm also, of course, thinking biblically. I'm also thinking of today on the West Bank. I'm thinking of Iraqi refugees in Lebanon, of Rwanda, of Colombia, Kosovo, Burma, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan. In fact, of all the locales in the world where forced migration has more often than not resulted in tens of thousands of people finding themselves in camps whose conditions are an insult to basic human decency. It's easy to forget that people are very often unmoored by traumatic border crossings within the boundary of their own country. Such is the case in Sudan, where since 1983, nearly 4 million people have been internally displaced. Astonishingly enough, 2 million people have been killed, and over 250,000 now live in exile beyond their homeland. And the situation is not much better in a country that I visited and wrote about 2 years ago, Sierra Leone. At the height of their 11-year civil war, almost half of the 4.5 million population was deemed to be displaced. And although many have now been resettled, enormous problems still exist. My own experience with internally displaced persons and refugees in Sierra Leone served only to confirm again my belief that the psychological damage that accompanies forced migrations, either within or across national borders, is far more enduring than the physical trauma, and its effects cannot be treated with food rations, with plastic sheeting, or with artificial limbs. Yet human beings have a tremendous capacity to absorb the chaos and the confusion that comes with migrations. As I've tried to suggest, it's a natural human impulse to wish to cross borders in search of people and places that might enable one to fulfill one's potential. And a fear of feeling displaced is never going to be a serious obstacle to those who wish to voluntarily migrate. For such people, it generally takes a few generations, often less, before the bewilderment and the hurt of displacement begin to recede and is replaced by the warm glow of belonging. But not so for those who have been forced to migrate against their will. There ought to be some mathematical equation that we can employ that might enable us to measure the degree of displacement with voluntary versus forced as one variable and time as another. The resulting figure would, of course, tell us something about the depth of historical memory. Diasporan Africans are a long, long memoried people. While driving in the hills beyond Accra, Awuje and I passed a large villa surrounded by a high concrete wall. Set on top of the wall were large, elaborate stone sculptures of lions. The wooden trim just beneath the roof was painted red, green, and gold, and the signboard by the wall of the compound revealed exactly what was going on. It read, Tough Gong International Recording Studios. On another board was a simple slogan, Hit Me with Rhythm. This property, high in the cool hills of Aburi, belonged to the widow of the Jamaican reggae superstar Bob Marley. Rita Marley had, as her late husband had always espoused, found her way back to her roots in Africa. And later on this same day, Awuje dropped me off at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center in Accra, the very place where the great African American lived and worked, and eventually, having come home to Africa, died at the age of 95. Indeed, a long, long memoried people. In 1961, Du Bois, having taken up his Ghanaian citizenship, was presented with this villa, a large white villa in the residential area of Accra known as cantonments, by President Kwame Nkrumah. Du Bois' second wife, Shirley Graham, quickly set about transforming the grounds into a lush garden whilst her husband busied himself with his writing. Today, the house and the grounds form the centerpiece of the Du Bois Center, which is an arts complex that is managed by Sekou Nkrumah, who is the son of the late president. He's a tall and a serious man in his mid-30s. As we walk around together, he tells me that he was educated in communist Romania, which I decide must explain some of his gravity. Sekou escorts me from the office the short distance to the main villa, and here I'm able to see the personal library of Du Bois, his academic gowns, his private photographs, the first edition of his books, his letters, his papers, but all of them have fallen to pieces and in a terrible state of disrepair. The torn curtains in the villa are hanging sadly from rails, and out in the grounds things are not much better. The government of Ghana owns this building, and Du Bois' gravesite and the tomb, which are also on the land. However, Sekou tells me that it's proved difficult to obtain funding to preserve the valuable evidence of one of the great American lives. I ask him about potential American help, but he smiles and then sighs, and he tells me that as long as the Ghanaian government claims ownership of the home and the contents, then Americans have made it clear that they're reluctant to invest in the upkeep and the preservation of the Du Bois Center. The professional and the personal turmoil which marked the displaced final 2 years of Du Bois' life as he moved from the United States to Ghana appears some 40 years later to have escalated into a squabble over his actual possessions. Later that same day, Awuje and I stand outside of Elmina Castle, and again he tells me he wishes to go to the United States of America. But despite the backdrop, he speaks without any sense of irony. He views the Atlantic slave trade as neither good nor bad. He just views it as history, and therefore dead and somewhat irrelevant. To those in the diaspora who continue to be long-memoried, the Atlantic slave trade is not only alive, it continues to be painful. The loss and the confusion of enduring the Atlantic crossing lingers in many to this day. However, Awuje has absolutely no interest in the psychological needs of displaced Africans in the diaspora. He wishes to go to America for the same reasons that my parents decided to come to Britain, and I decided to stay in the United States, to grow. And that's just fine. Awuje doesn't know anybody in the United States, and he's never come face to face with a winter. But he's not afraid of any difficulties that such a move might cause him. In fact, he's already factored in such difficulties as simply part of the price of the ticket. Displacement, whatever. He just wants a chance. That's all, and who can blame him? Voluntary crossing of borders in an attempt to seize such opportunities is one of the oldest and the most natural of human instincts. One that I decide we should respect, and when necessary, one that we should vigorously encourage. Thank you.